Hook. For 15 years, Uncle Mike has been asking for money until payday, promising to return it within a week. The amount has accumulated to $50,000, and I decided to find out where it all disappears. I still remember the first time Uncle Mike showed up at our door with that sheepish smile and his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. I was maybe 12 then, sitting at the kitchen table doing homework while Mom made dinner. He knocked twice, real soft-like, and when Mom opened the door, his whole face lit up like Christmas morning. The conversation always started the same way. He'd compliment Mom on her cooking, ask about my grades, maybe ruffle my hair if I was within reach. Then came the pause, that awkward silence where he'd clear his throat and his smile would get a little tighter around the edges. That's when you knew it was coming. His car needed new brakes. Just $200, and he'd have it back to Mom by Friday when his paycheck came through. He'd already talked to his supervisor about picking up some overtime shifts. Cross his heart, hope to die, he'd never ask again if she could just help him out this once. Mom never hesitated. She'd disappear into the bedroom where she kept the emergency cash in an old jewelry box and come back counting out 20s. Uncle Mike would hug her tight, promise her the world, and be gone before Dad got home from work. The pattern continued month after month, year after year. The stories got more elaborate, more desperate. His landlord was threatening eviction. The electric company was going to shut off his power. He needed medication for a back injury from when he fell off a ladder at work. Each crisis was more urgent than the last, and each time, our family opened their wallets. What really got to me wasn't just the money, though. It was watching how the whole family rallied around him every single time. Grandma would shake her head and mutter about how hard life was for her youngest son, how he'd always been unlucky but had such a good heart. Dad would grumble a little but ultimately shrug and say family was family. My aunts would chip in too, especially during the holidays when Uncle Mike would show up looking particularly worn down. By the time I graduated high school, I'd started keeping track. Not because I was suspicious at first, but because I was curious about numbers. I'd always been good with math, and something about the frequency of his visits nagged at me. I started a simple notebook, jotting down dates and amounts whenever I overheard the conversations. 200 here, 300 there. Sometimes it was $50 for groceries, sometimes it was $800 for car repairs. The amounts varied, but the timing was consistent. Every 3 to 4 weeks, like clockwork, Uncle Mike would appear with a new emergency. When I started college, I had to take out student loans because our family couldn't afford to help with tuition. I remember sitting in the financial aid office, looking at all the paperwork, thinking about how Uncle Mike had just borrowed $500 the week before for what he claimed was a root canal. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I kept my mouth shut. Family loyalty ran deep in our house, and questioning Uncle Mike's needs was like questioning the family itself. The real turning point came during my junior year. I'd been home for spring break, and Uncle Mike made one of his regular appearances. This time, he needed $1,500 for what he described as emergency surgery for a hernia. He had all the details down pat, knew exactly which hospital, which doctor, even had a date scheduled. The whole family was in crisis mode, worried sick about him. I offered to drive him to the hospital, maybe sit with him during the procedure. Be supportive. The look of panic that flashed across his face lasted maybe half a second, but I caught it. He quickly explained that his friend was already handling the transportation, that he didn't want to be a burden, that he'd call as soon as the surgery was over. That night, I sat down with my notebook and really looked at the numbers for the first time. Over 6 years of semi-regular tracking, I had documented over $30,000 in loans. $30,000 that had never been repaid, never even mentioned again after the initial transaction. I decided to extend my research. I started asking casual questions during family gatherings, comparing notes with my aunts and cousins. The picture that emerged was staggering. Uncle Mike wasn't just borrowing from my parents. He was making the rounds to every family member who had a steady income. My conservative estimate put the total somewhere around $50,000 over 15 years. When I finally worked up the courage to approach my parents with the spreadsheet I'd created, their reaction caught me completely off guard. Dad got angry, not at Uncle Mike, but at me. He accused me of being petty and heartless, of keeping score when family should be about unconditional support. Mom was quieter but equally disappointed. She said I was young and didn't understand how hard life could be for some people, how Uncle Mike had always struggled but was trying his best. The conversation ended with them telling me that if I couldn't show compassion for family, maybe I needed to reevaluate my priorities. I felt like I was going crazy. How was I the villain for pointing out that we'd essentially given away enough money to buy a decent used car? I backed off for a while, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I started paying closer attention to Uncle Mike himself rather than just the money. During family barbecues, I noticed he always seemed to have nice clothes, newer shoes than anyone else in the family. His car might need constant repairs according to his stories, but it was actually in pretty good shape whenever I saw it parked outside. The breakthrough came completely by accident. I was in the city for a job interview, stopped at a diner for lunch before heading back home. The place was pretty busy, and I was scrolling through my phone while waiting for my food when I heard this familiar laugh from across the room. Uncle Mike was sitting in a corner booth with two other guys, and they were having what looked like a pretty intense conversation. He was wearing a leather jacket I'd never seen before and had a thick stack of cash on the table in front of him. My stomach dropped. I paid for my lunch and got out of there before he could spot me, but the image was burned into my brain. I spent the next few weeks doing something that felt like stalking my own uncle, but I had to know. I started making excuses to drive through different parts of town, keeping an eye out for his car. What I discovered made me physically sick. Update 1. I followed Uncle Mike to 3 different locations over the course of 2 weeks, and each time, my worst fears were confirmed. The first place was a small casino about 40 minutes outside of town. I watched him walk in on a Thursday afternoon and didn't see him come out until almost midnight. I waited in my car in the parking lot for hours, alternating between rage and disbelief. The second location was even worse. It was one of those underground card rooms that operates in the gray area between legal and illegal gambling. I only found it because I followed his car down a series of increasingly sketchy back streets until he pulled into what looked like an abandoned warehouse. There were maybe 15 other cars there, and through a grimy window, I could see tables set up with people hunched over cards and dice. The third place broke my heart completely. It was the big commercial casino downtown, the one with all the flashy lights and promotions. I watched Uncle Mike stride through those doors like he owned the place, greeting the security guard by name, heading straight to what I later learned were the high-stakes poker tables. I sat in my car in that casino parking lot for 3 hours, trying to process what this meant for my family. Every dollar we'd scraped together to help him with his emergencies had gone directly to fund his gambling addiction. Every story about medical bills and car repairs and rent money had been a lie designed to manipulate the people who loved him most. But here's the thing that really messed with my head. I started to realize that on some level, Uncle Mike probably believed his own stories. When he promised to pay the money back, I think part of him genuinely intended to. He probably walked into those casinos thinking this would be the time he'd win big and be able to return everyone's money with interest. The problem was, that's not how gambling addiction works. I spent the next few days researching gambling addiction, reading testimonials from families who'd been through similar situations. The patterns were all there. The elaborate lies, the manufactured emergencies, the way he'd always seemed just on the verge of turning his life around. The guilt trips when anyone questioned him. The way he'd target the most compassionate family members and play up their protective instincts. Armed with this new understanding, I decided to try a different approach with my parents. Instead of leading with accusations about Uncle Mike, I started by sharing what I'd learned about gambling addiction in general. I printed out articles about how the disease affects families, how gamblers become expert manipulators not out of malice but out of desperation to feed their addiction. Mom listened quietly, but I could see the wheels turning in her head. Dad was more resistant, but even he started asking questions about the specifics of gambling addiction. The conversation took almost 3 hours, and by the end of it, they weren't ready to cut Uncle Mike off completely, but they were at least willing to consider that there might be more to his financial problems than bad luck. The real test came 2 weeks later when Uncle Mike showed up with another emergency. This time, his story was that he needed $1,200 to cover the deposit on a new apartment because his current landlord was selling the building. He had all his usual details ready, knew exactly which complex he was moving to, had specific dates when he needed to be out of his old place. Instead of immediately reaching for her purse, Mom asked to see the eviction notice. Uncle Mike's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, hurt, indignation. He wanted to know why she didn't trust him, whether his own sister really thought he was a liar. The performance was Oscar-worthy, and I could see Mom wavering. But then Dad surprised me. He said if Uncle Mike really needed help with moving expenses, they'd be happy to write a check directly to the new landlord. They could call right now and handle the deposit over the phone. Uncle Mike's panic was visible this time. He started backtracking, saying the landlord only accepted cash, that it was complicated, that he'd figure something else out. That's when Mom finally saw it. The same look I'd caught during the fake hernia surgery story. The moment when the lie became too elaborate to maintain and the truth leaked through the cracks. Uncle Mike left that night without any money, and I could tell he was confused by the change in dynamics. For 15 years, his system had worked perfectly. Show up, tell a compelling story, get cash, disappear until the next crisis. Now suddenly there were questions and verification requirements, and his whole operation was falling apart. Update 2. The confrontation I'd been dreading finally happened 3 weeks after Mom and Dad started questioning Uncle Mike's stories. He showed up at the house on a Sunday afternoon while I was visiting, and this time he skipped the small talk entirely. He was angry, defensive, and desperate in a way I'd never seen before. He accused our family of abandoning him when he needed help the most. He said we'd all gotten selfish and materialistic, that we'd forgotten what it meant to care about family. The guilt trip was intense, and I watched Mom's resolve start to crumble in real time. This was her little brother, the same person she'd protected from bullies when they were kids, and he was standing in her kitchen looking genuinely hurt and confused. But then he made a mistake. In his frustration, he let slip a detail about needing money for his car payment that didn't match the story he'd told 2 months earlier about that same car being repossessed. It was a small inconsistency, the kind of thing you might not notice if you weren't paying attention, but I'd been keeping track of his stories for years. I called him out on it. Not aggressively, just a simple question about which version was true. The look he gave me was pure hatred, but underneath that was something else. Fear. He realized that someone had been paying attention, that his carefully constructed narratives were being examined and compared. What happened next changed everything. Instead of trying to explain the inconsistency or make up another story, Uncle Mike just broke down. Not fake tears designed to manipulate us, but real, ugly crying that came from somewhere deep inside. He collapsed into one of our kitchen chairs and started talking. He told us about the first time he'd walked into a casino, 20 years ago, just after his divorce. He'd been lonely and depressed, and the bright lights and excitement had made him feel alive for the first time in months. He'd won $300 that first night, and the rush had been incredible. The wins became less frequent, but the need for that feeling grew stronger. He started borrowing small amounts from friends to cover his losses, always planning to pay them back after the next big win. When the friends stopped lending, he turned to family. When family members started asking questions, he got better at crafting stories that would bypass their logic and appeal directly to their emotions. He talked about lying awake at night, hating himself for what he was doing to the people who loved him. He'd sworn to himself countless times that he would stop, that he'd pay everyone back, that he'd get his life together. But the addiction was stronger than his willpower, and the debt kept growing until it felt impossible to ever dig out from under it. The most heartbreaking part was when he admitted that he'd been stealing from himself too. He'd cashed out his retirement account years ago, sold family heirlooms that had been passed down to him, even pawned his wedding ring from his failed marriage. Our family's money wasn't the only source he'd been tapping, just the most reliable one. By the time he finished talking, we were all crying. The anger I'd been carrying for months started to transform into something more complicated. I was still furious about the lies and manipulation, but I also felt this overwhelming sadness for the person my uncle had become. This wasn't some criminal mastermind preying on innocent victims. This was a sick person who'd been drowning for years and had pulled his own family down with him. The question became what to do next. Simply cutting him off financially wasn't going to solve the underlying problem, and it might just drive him to find more desperate sources of money. But continuing to enable his addiction wasn't an option either. Mom surprised me by taking charge of the situation. She told Uncle Mike that she loved him and wanted to help him, but not in the way she'd been helping him before. She said if he was serious about getting better, she'd support him in finding treatment, but there would be no more cash loans under any circumstances. Dad was more practical. He said Uncle Mike could come over for dinner whenever he wanted, that he'd always have a place in the family, but the financial relationship was over. If he needed help with bills, they could pay utilities directly or buy groceries. No more cash, no exceptions. Uncle Mike's reaction was mixed. Part of him seemed relieved that the secret was finally out, that he didn't have to keep manufacturing crises and maintaining lies. But another part of him was terrified. He'd been depending on family money to feed his addiction for so long that he didn't know how he was going to survive without it. He asked for one more loan, just enough to cover his rent for the month while he figured out his next steps. The request was almost reflexive, like a knee-jerk response to any stressful situation. When Mom gently but firmly said no, he got angry again, accused us of kicking him while he was down. But then something shifted. Maybe it was seeing that his usual manipulation tactics weren't working anymore. Or maybe it was genuine exhaustion from carrying the weight of his lies for so long. He asked what treatment options were available, whether our health insurance would cover any kind of gambling addiction program. That's when I realized that this conversation, as painful as it was, might actually be the beginning of something better. For the first time in 15 years, we were talking about Uncle Mike's actual problems instead of the fictional emergencies he'd been creating to hide those problems. Final update. 6 months have passed since that Sunday afternoon confrontation, and I honestly wasn't sure I'd ever be writing this final update. The road to recovery for gambling addiction isn't linear, and there were several times when I thought Uncle Mike was going to disappear entirely rather than face the work of getting better. The first month was the hardest. Uncle Mike went through what I can only describe as withdrawal, not just from gambling, but from the adrenaline rush of successfully manipulating people who loved him. He'd been living on crisis energy for so long that normal, steady life felt unbearably boring by comparison. He tried to test our boundaries multiple times. He'd show up with stories that weren't quite lies but weren't the whole truth either. He needed money for job interview clothes, but I suspect he was planning to use it to place just one small bet to see if his luck had changed. He asked to borrow Dad's car for a day, and we later found out he'd driven it to a casino parking lot and sat there for 2 hours before driving home without going inside. The breakthrough came when Uncle Mike finally accepted that he needed more help than our family could provide. Mom had researched gambling addiction support groups and found one that met twice a week at a community center downtown. She offered to drive him to the first meeting, and though he was resistant at first, he eventually agreed to try it. What he found there was a room full of people who understood exactly what he'd been going through. Not just the gambling part, but the lying, the manipulation, the self-hatred that comes with hurting the people you love most. For the first time in years, he was able to talk honestly about his experiences without having to maintain any pretenses. The group had a structured program for making amends, which included writing letters to family members acknowledging the harm that had been caused and outlining specific steps for rebuilding trust. Uncle Mike's letter to our family was 12 pages long, handwritten, and brutally honest about the extent of his deception. He'd been stealing from us for longer than even I had realized. The $50,000 I'd calculated was actually closer to $70,000 when he included money he'd taken from Grandma before she passed away, Christmas gifts that had been meant for his kids but never reached them, and several instances where he'd forged signatures on checks from family members who'd trusted him with their banking information. Reading that letter was like getting punched in the stomach repeatedly, but it was also strangely healing. Finally, we had the complete truth instead of fragments and suspicions. Uncle Mike had been carrying the weight of all those secrets alone, and sharing them with us seemed to lift something heavy off his shoulders. The most surprising development was his relationship with work. It turned out that Uncle Mike was actually talented at his job when he wasn't distracted by gambling debts and the need to constantly generate emergency cash. Once he stopped spending his mental energy on maintaining lies and planning his next casino visit, his performance improved dramatically. He got a promotion 4 months into his recovery, which came with a significant pay raise. He's been using that extra income to slowly pay back the family. Not because we demanded it, but because the support group emphasized that making financial amends was an important part of healing the relationships he'd damaged. He started with small amounts, $20 or $30 every couple of weeks, always accompanied by a note explaining what the payment was for. The money itself isn't what matters most. What matters is that Uncle Mike is rebuilding his credibility through consistent, honest actions instead of grand promises he can't keep. He's learning to communicate about his problems before they become crises, to ask for emotional support instead of financial bailouts. He's also had relapses. 3 times in 6 months, he's gambled away money he needed for bills or expenses. Each time, he came to the family the next day, admitted what had happened, and asked for help figuring out how to handle the practical consequences without borrowing money. Those conversations were painful, but they were honest in a way that our family had never experienced with Uncle Mike before. The biggest change is in our family dynamics. We've all had to learn new ways of showing love and support that don't involve opening our wallets every time someone we care about is struggling. It's been harder than I expected, but also more meaningful. When Uncle Mike comes over for dinner now, we spend time actually talking to each other instead of him performing crisis stories and us performing financial rescue operations. Grandma would have been proud of how this turned out. She'd always believed that Uncle Mike had a good heart underneath his problems, and she was right. It just took 15 years of enabling his addiction before we figured out how to help him access that good heart without destroying ourselves in the process. I still keep track of Uncle Mike's payments, not because I don't trust him, but because seeing the slow, steady progress helps me believe that change is really possible. We're nowhere near the full $70,000 he owes the family, and we may never get there completely. But we've got something more valuable than money now. We've got honesty, and we've got our uncle back.